What we're going to cover today, just talk about players that hit fades and slices and kind of the differences with players that hit draws. So if you listen to the one about players that hit draws, it's pretty much going to be the opposite. Um, so feel free if you have any questions, you can drop them in the chat as we go. And then at the end, we can answer any questions that you might have as well. So, first, I like to start with good players and just kind of show the difference between a player that hits a draw and a fade. So, two classic kind of like faders of the golf ball. I have Brooks here, Brooks Koepka, that I'm going to show first. And then I'll also show Viktor Hovland with that. And then I'm going to lay out some examples of like why a player might slice. So I have a bunch of examples of that. Now, the biggest thing that I love to look at these for players that hit draws and fades, and if they're kind of organizing their body properly in order to hit those shots. So one of the big differences that you're going to notice with players that hit fades and players that hit draws is going to be this relationship between the turn in a player's side bend as they go into impact. So with Brooks here, what we're going to see is, Brooks does a really good job turning his body, and on the way down, as he works into impact, we're going to see how he's going to have more turn than he does side bend. So when you see a player that has more turn than side bend, typically that's going to be a path that's going to get a little bit more left. They're going to hit more pulls. They're going to hit more fades. The opposite is true with the draw or the golf ball. So a player like Rory, who loves to hit draws, you're actually going to see these numbers kind of flipped around a little bit. You'll see Rory with more side bend than he would have turn. Now, the gap between the two is actually really important too. So with Brooks Koepka here, you can see there's roughly like a 6-degree gap. If it starts to get more than, I would say like from 0 to 6 degrees, if it starts getting more than that, the ball can start curving a lot. So players that hit big hooks or big slices, a lot of the times you will see that gap between the chest turn and chest side bend be a pretty large number. If I pull up Viktor Hovland, we're going to notice very, very similar with the chest turn, chest side bend relationship here. So Viktor gets up to the top. On the way down, we're going to see in transition, he does a really, really good job of turning his body and rotating. And as he gets into impact here, he's going to have 43 degrees of turn and 39 degrees of side bend. So he has that 4-degree gap that we're kind of looking for. The less that gap, the straighter the ball is going to fly. So for Viktor here, once again, he kind of falls into that pattern of loves to hit fades. Most of the time he's going to hit fades. And it's because he's rotating more than he is side bending. That moves the path a little bit more left. That's going to help him hit the ball where it's going to be a fade or a little pull, just depending on what they're trying to do there. So if we bring up some, not as good players and start to look at why players might slice a little bit, I'm going to use, let's just start with this player right here. All right, so this is kind of your classic beginner golfer right here. Plays on a high school team and hits a pretty good pull and fade at times. So what we're going to notice for this player as he goes up to the top of his backswing here, we're going to see how his pelvis has moved 3.7 inches away from the target and his chest has stayed at 0. So essentially, this is that classic like reverse pivot that you might see on your lesson tee. Now, the reason why that's important is because when a player has that reverse pivot, then they're forced with two different options. They can either learn how to slide their hip forward a lot. It's going to move anywhere from 7 to 8 inches, which would then get their upper body to kind of tilt back, and they're going to be kind of hitting those hooks, more or less, some nice draws every now and then, but they're definitely relying on themselves having a lot of lateral motion. They're going to be losing their posture in order to hit that draw. So a lot of times what you'll see is like a player that's hitting slices, it's the opposite. The chest in transition is going to stay out in front of the pelvis. So you can see how the chest is closer to the target than the pelvis. And what that does, I'm going to pull up his 2D video. It's going to shift his hand path here. So you'll see as he goes up to the top, now his chest is going to stay out in front of the pelvis. That's pushing his hands out, and he's trying to do everything in his power to not hit big slices. So, being pretty athletic, he learned how to get his left wrist to be a little bit bowed. That's helping him square the face a little bit, but still going to have that tendencies to hit pulls and slices because of that. So this is something that you're going to see, pretty frequently in golfers, is that they're going to have that reverse pivot at the top of their swing. And when they have that reverse pivot on the way down, then their chest is going to get out in front of the pelvis. So you can see for this player, at left arm parallel in the downswing, their chest is 2.5 inches in front of the pelvis. So eventually, what most players, if they're just kind of learning on their own and they're somewhat athletic, what they then learn to do, like I said, is they'll learn how to get their pelvis to slide forward a lot. And then that lets them hang back. But obviously, they're going to hit more draws and hooks, have some issues with contact when they go that route too. So I'll show a few more examples with players that kind of have that same tendency here. All right, so here's a lefty. I'm just going to pull up his chest turn, pelvis sway, chest sway. And as this player gets up to the top, you're going to see very, very similar to that other player. Pelvis 3.5 inches away from the target, chest moved about an inch. And the other thing that you'll notice is this player turns quite a bit. And because of that, they're going to have a lot of chest bend at the top. They have negative 13 degrees there. Now, why that's important is because typically when you see a player with a reverse pivot, they're going to also probably have a reverse spine angle where that chest does have a lot of extension at the top. Those things do make it very hard for a player then to be able to turn properly. And that's obviously going to cause some issues here. So what we're going to see for this player, very, very similar to the other one, is that the chest is going to stay out in front of the pelvis in transition. Now, this player is definitely going to do a better job at trying to get that pelvis back in front, but it happens a little bit late and the club's going to kind of tip out at the bottom. Right at the bottom, it's going to get just a little bit outside and he's going to hit little pulls and slices from that. And then you'll see as he goes into impact here, right, his turn is going to be larger than his side bend. So it kind of fits that profile that I was talking about with players that hit fades. Now, another good example of why a player might hit slices is just the amount of turn that a player gets in the backswing. And maybe they lack some depth. I'll try to find it. Here we go. Okay. So here's a player that's going to be lacking a little bit of depth in the backswing. So I'm going to pull up the turn number. I'm going to pull up the sway numbers too, just so we can see them. But what we're going to see for her is on the way back, you could see how she's not really turning a whole lot. Her chest is moved to 83 degrees. Her pelvis is moved to 34. We're going to see that her chest gets closer to the target than her pelvis. So once again, that's kind of that classic reverse pivot. Now, for her, because she's not turning enough, we're going to see at the top of her backswing that she does not get enough depth, where her arms aren't going to get behind her enough. So look at the top of the backswing here. If we draw, a line going just straight down, we can see how it's kind of over the balls of the foot there. Because of that lack of turn, because of the lack of depth, on the way down, her hand path gets shifted out. And then now she's trying to do everything in her power to get this club not to get too far outside. And so she's starting to stand up. She'll start to lean back and she'll have that lead wrist a little bit bowed. And from there, she hits lots of pulls with this and just like little fades. With a driver, this can become a little bit bigger of a slice because of that. So for this player, and a lot of players is will notice that if we can get a little bit more depth in the backswing, where we can move their arms a little bit more behind them, get a little bit more turn, it's really going to help improve that hand path. And I'll show another example of that here. So once again, if I pull up those turn numbers, we take it up to the top, we're going to notice for this player that her backswing is only 68 degrees of chest turn, 27 with the pelvis. And once again, from a down the line standpoint, we're just going to notice because of that lack of depth that her hands are going to get pushed out quite a bit in the downswing. So you'll see here in transition how her hands, hands are going to get pushed out, and that's because of that lack of depth. Once again, if we can get her to turn a little bit more, get the arms a little bit more behind her, a little bit more depth, that's going to make it a lot easier for her hand path to get behind where it should be, instead of the hands pushing out and her hitting those slices. So that's another just classic example of why a player might hit some of those fades that you have. Just to kind of show you a few other ones and just show, how these patterns kind of just continue to show up with players that do hit fades. I'm going to look at this player with you. All right, so once again, as this player goes up to the top, we're going to see pelvis 3.1 inches away from the target, chest 1.6. So classic little reverse pivot. Because of that, in transition on the way down, we're going to see the chest will stay out in front of that pelvis. And then from there, as this player works into impact, you're going to notice that their pelvis sway's only been 2 inches. So they have a tendency to also hang back on this. And anytime that they're starting to hang back like that, once again, from a down the line standpoint, that's going to get the hand path pushed out on the way down. And then you're going to see him flip at it and hit slices from there. Let me just pull up a player that hits draws just so you guys can kind of see the difference here. All right. So this is one of my professionals that I work with. And I'm first going to show you guys the difference between his golf swing. This is going to be one where he's going to be hitting more, I believe, fade. Just give me a sec. So this player of mine, you'll hear me talk about him all the time since I've worked with him for so long. He hits pretty much 85%, 90% of the time. He's hitting just little draws. He can hit a fade every once in a while, but he just has a lot of comfort in seeing the ball start a little bit right, coming back a little bit. This player was just at the Latin America Q School, and during his round, he started hitting pulls. And it's really nice to be able to work with your peers on, Sportsbox and help them understand, why these things are happening in terms of like why the path all of a sudden started to shift compared to where he normally is. Okay, so for this player here, as he takes the club up to the top, something that he's always going to do, he's always going to have his chest be just a little bit closer to the target. Now, you are going to see a lot of tour players at the top of their swing have the chest slightly closer than the pelvis. It's because a lot of times that recentering that'll happen, where as they get to right around left arm parallel, a little bit after that, they're going to start to move back towards the target. So you'll see the pelvis and chest sway become less. You can see that here. Now, on the way down, what we normally notice, and I'll show you this for when he hits lots of draws, is this player, his pelvis sway is normally right at like 6 inches all the time. And his chest will be at like 0.5 to 1 inch. So we're seeing for him that his chest is getting just a little bit higher or a little bit closer to the target than normal. And what ends up happening for him as he gets into transition then is at impact, he's going to start to turn a little bit more than he's side bending. And so it was really good for him to kind of understand his tendencies that anytime that he starts hitting pulls, he starts to not have enough side bend, and his hand path gets pushed out on the way down. And that's what's causing him to get on TrackMan. It's a little bit more like zeroed out. But for him, it's not going to be too conducive to the draws that he likes to hit. So what he needed to feel at the Latin America Q school when he was playing is he just had to feel a little bit more side bend. And he was able to recognize that and actually, play some pretty good golf down the stretch with that little slight adjustment. If I show you kind of his swing normally, when he's hitting lots of draws, we're going to see a little bit of a difference here. So as he goes up to the top, we're going to see chest a little bit closer to the pelvis, or a little bit closer to the target than the pelvis. And then on the way down, as he gets into impact here, we're going to see more pelvis sway. He's going to be at 6 inches. And then notice here how his side bends now at 24, his chest turns at 17. So for him, that's typically what we're going to see because he loves to hit those draws, right? When he hits fades, it's because in transition, his hands get pushed out and then he starts to turn more than he's side bending. So it's really great for those great players that you work with, for them to kind of understand their tendencies and what happens in the golf swing and why they might be hitting some of those shots. For Nick, it's definitely allowed him to have a really consistent year with this. So those are a couple examples on kind of the differences between players that hit draws, players that hit fades, why players are slicing. I think most of the time, why you're going to see a player hit a slice is going to be from how they're swaying on the way back. Typically, you are going to see a reverse pivot. You're going to see somebody where their chest is getting closer to the target than the pelvis. Most tour pros have a little bit of that, but the amount is a lot different. So with a player that has like a pretty good reverse pivot, there's probably going to be 2-3 inches difference between the chest and the pelvis. With a player that's better, you might see half an inch to an inch, just depending. And that difference, the 2 to 3 inches to the half inch to inch difference, really makes a difference in transition and how that player's hips start to move. And like I said, typically from like a, just kind of a learning standpoint of a player who's trying to figure it out, we'll see this player who gets that classic little, reverse pivot and then hits those big slices because their chest gets so far out in front of them. We'll see them learn to start to slide a lot. So they'll start to excessively start to slide forward in order to get the ball to go a little bit straighter, and then that's going to turn into a huge hook. And I'm sure you guys have seen that pattern nonstop on a lesson tee, but it's always good to be able to kind of show that in a 3D standpoint and what's happening there. And then the other great example is just players that don't turn enough. When a player doesn't turn enough, they don't get enough depth, then they need to do something in order to kind of create that depth or get the club to come from the inside. Any questions, guys? Does all this make sense?